Continuing with our look at explanations for homicide, Chapter 6 examines social and cultural explanations. So these are explanations and theories that focus on factors outside of individuals. And this begins with the idea that our environment influences our actions. We do know that different groups in society have different rates of offending and victimization. So men are more likely to be victims and offenders. Southerners have higher rates of homicide, and African Americans and poor folks are also overrepresented as offenders and victims. So what's happening that causes these differences or these disparate rates? Criminologists study correlates of homicide at an aggregate level, so we tend to put all the data together and study it that way. Or we also investigate social histories of individual offenders, and that allows us to maybe examine the context of criminal homicides. The drawback to that approach, though, is we can't generalize that to all offenders. So recall that the classical school, we have the classical school perspective is the idea that offenders have free will choice and that they essentially choose, they calculate the pros and cons of their behavior before deciding what to do. So Beccaria argues that people are rational and hedonistic. They possess free will. They make decisions about how they act, and they do so by weighing the costs and benefits of their potential actions. He's the father of the classical school of criminology, and he's arguing for reform in the Italian court system during the Enlightenment period. And this theory is still very appealing today. In the U.S. here, we really value individualism, and so we see this playing a role here. Rational choice theory. It says people are rational and consider the risks before acting, and so that has grown out of Beccaria's perspective. And deterrence theory does as well. This is the idea that laws may have a deterrent effect on human behavior. If the criminal justice system gets set up so that someone who violates a law is likely to be caught and punished, people will be less likely to commit crimes. So one theory that develops out of the University of Chicago is this theory of social disorganization. So in 1942, Shaw and McKay are looking at immigrant groups, and they're looking at an ecological theory of crime. So they're looking at a central business district, and essentially if you were to target like draw like a target, like a bullseye, a dartboard around it, you have these concentric circles. And basically what he found is that there's a transitional zone of the city as we're moving away from the business area into the more residential area. And that regardless of which immigrant group lived there at the time, that zone always had higher crime rates. So it's not so much the actual people that are living there, but the conditions of that area. This is an area that had poorer housing than other areas, higher rates of poverty, fewer intact families, and less sense of a community. So what they're basically arguing then is that the community is disorganized. There are unclear norms, and there's a lack of structure that keeps individuals in line. Shaw and McKay were criticized here for using official crime rates because perhaps police are looking at the inner city and urban areas and policing them more heavily, and therefore leading to higher official crime rates. So, social disorganization is also criticized then for failing to explain why some people who live in those disorganized areas do not commit crime and why some people who live in organized areas do. So recent homicide studies don't appear to support these basic ideas, at least for homicide. So a 2000 study found greater economic disadvantage and low home ownership rates were correlated with does support these basic ideas, with higher homicide rates. But these factors seem to operate differently for black and white homicide rates because of the fact that African Americans are much more likely to experience severe economic disadvantage. Differential association theory is argued by Edwin Sutherland. He never puts this in a journal article. It's written in a textbook. And he wants to explain why crime is more common in poor areas. And he says that basically crime is learned like everything else we do. We learn it. We learn how to do it and why to do it. And we learn that from people that are close to us. Through our family and peers, we're exposed to ideas about the law and whether or not we see the law as a positive or a negative thing. We learn that certain laws should be followed while other laws may be considered unimportant and not necessary to follow. So differential association explains some homicides better than others. For example, gang killings are likely learned, and the gang members are going to learn values of violence and homicide for protecting one's turf. Studies of children who have killed, men and women who have killed intimate partners, and even serial killers have found exposure to violence in their childhoods is common. So this doesn't prove differential association. It does give some support to the idea that violence is a learned behavior. Social control theory assumes that people will commit crimes. And if you recall, social control theory is trying to explain why some people don't commit crimes. So something has to exist that prevents people from committing crimes. And generally, this is our connection to conventional other people. So Durkheim in 1893 is one of the first social control theorists, and he talks about anomie. And he basically talks about anomie as a state of normlessness. And he talks about how when industrialization occurred, societies became complex, they became much bigger, and more deviance was likely because community and family ties are weaker. So we have less to lose by not conforming. Toby refers to this as a stake in conformity. We should see more crime when people are less connected, and we're more likely to violate norms if we have nothing to lose by doing so. And when we look at the U.S. and other Western countries, the homicide rates are highest in urban areas. So based on Durkheim's theory of anomie, we would expect more homicides in urban areas because people are less connected to each other. In smaller towns and rural areas, people are more likely to know each other and therefore less likely to victimize each other. In 1969, Hershey proposed social bond theory. The more we're connected to conventional others in society, the less likely we are to commit crime. And our bonds are formed through the way we're socialized by parents and teachers and other people that are important to us, but mostly parents and teachers. So bond is made up of 4 elements: attachment, involvement, commitment, and belief. So belief is exactly what it sounds like. It's your morals and your personal beliefs. Commitment is that stake and conformity factor. How dedicated are we to legitimate pursuits? Involvement is how much time we spend doing legitimate activities. The more involved you are, the less time you have to engage in crime. And attachment is how close we are to conventional individuals. Whenever these elements become weak, norm violation is more likely to occur because we are less bonded to society. So people who are not bonded to others are most likely to commit homicide. And if you think about this in terms of offending in general, while we certainly none of us want to go to prison or get in trouble, I think the thing that probably keeps most of us out of trouble is that we're concerned what other people think about us. And I don't mean this in a negative way, but we're concerned about our family and how we would jeopardize those relationships. Hershey and Gottfredson in 1990 proposed that a combination of low self-control and opportunity leads to criminal behavior, and they put together this general theory of crime. And what they're examining is low self-control. And they argue that low self-control is a result of poor or absent parenting. So if children do not have good parenting, they don't learn to set goals and work for what they want, and they don't learn how to control their tempers. This may lead to them becoming impulsive, and if you're impulsive, you tend to act without much thought as to how it affects others. So this is a theory that could explain spur-of-the-moment homicides. A passion murder in which a man kills his wife for being in bed with another man, or when a cashier doesn't hand over cash during a robbery. This is not a theory that would explain something that's carefully planned, because something that's carefully planned is by nature not impulsive. Sykes and Matza talk about neutralization theory. They find that delinquent youths do know and understand the rules, and that they tend to drift in and out of delinquent behavior. And the way they do this is by neutralizing their behavior. They learn how to justify or explain their situations in a way that justifies the behavior. So these include things like denial of responsibility, denial of injury, denial of a victim, condemnation of the condemners, and appeal to higher loyalties. So basically, when we deny responsibility, we're saying something like, it's not my fault. You know how I am when I drink, it's not my fault. Denial of injury is the idea that nobody actually got hurt. Denial of the victim is an interesting one. This is where you're basically saying that someone is somehow less human than you, or they deserve what has happened to them. Condemning the condemners is something you might have done when you were breaking rules when you were a teenager. If you knew your parents broke those same rules, you might have said, oh, they do the same thing, or they do worse. And an appeal to higher loyalty is when you do something because you have to do it for loyalty to your family, to your brothers, to whomever. So a woman may decide to kill her stepfather who has abused her and her sister, and she may argue that it's not her fault, but rather his, or she may argue that he deserved it. A serial killer may seek out prostitutes to kill and believe he isn't causing any harm, that they're somehow less than other people. Terrorists may believe that a government has done what they believe to be horrible acts, and that someone may kill someone who has hurt their family as an appeal to their higher loyalties. Katz, in his book Seduction of Crime, talks about murder as righteous slaughter and argues that when killers know the victim, they may justify the crime in their own mind. So, for example, Joshua Torres killed Richard Tunley after Torres walked in on Tunley beginning to molest Torres' 2-year-old daughter. Katz would argue that Torres felt justified in killing Tunley. So Katz argues basically that a killer may think a potential victim is doing something that the killer just can't ignore, and the killer turns personal humiliation into rage. So some killers see themselves as pushed into their behavior by forces greater than themselves. We also can look at correlates of homicide. What are traits that tend to be related to homicide? So while anyone can be a victim of homicide, the odds of being murdered do vary, and they are higher for some people than others. So our race, our sex, our social class, and where we live can affect our chances of being murdered. So offending is the highest amongst African Americans, Southerners, men, people of lower class, and people in the U.S. compared to other industrialized nations. And this is true for both offending and victimization. Victims and offenders tend to be similar to each other. Wolfgang also studies hundreds of cases of homicide in Philadelphia and found that many of them involved black men who were involved in confrontations that ended in the death of one of them. Wolfgang later followed this up with a study with Ferracuti where they talk about what's called the subculture of violence. And they said that a subculture of violence exists. And in this book, they're talking more about this existing amongst African Americans, but this has been talked about in terms of other groups as well. So basically, people who grow up in a subculture of violence learn that violence is an appropriate response. And not just that under some circumstances it may be justified, but in some circumstances it's actually required. So if you ignore a challenge to you, you're violating the norms of that subculture of violence, and then if something happens to you, it's kind of your own fault. This has also been looked at in terms of a Southern subculture of violence. A lot of people, when they talk about this, they talk about it in general with both of these subcultures together. And basically the explanation for why this occurs in the South is that this is this long military tradition and a Southern subculture of honor. This explains higher rates of homicide in the South. White men in this culture have learned that backing down is considered weak and unmanly. And so again, similar to what we just talked about, retaliation is expected when someone has been challenged or insulted. We might also look at our lifestyle and routine activities theories. So these are both theories that look at the lifestyles and habits of victims and offenders. Are there things that you do throughout your day that put you at higher risk? So one thing we happen to know is that college students are at much higher risk for certain victimization as well. So lifestyle theory looks particularly at how your lifestyle might put you at risk. So if you're gang involved or you're in the drug trade, that would put you at higher risk. Whereas routine activity says that there's 3 elements that have to combine in time in order for a crime to occur. We need a motivated offender, a suitable target, and for there to be no capable guardians present. There's also some feminist perspectives on masculinity. So in the 90s, criminologists began to explore that connection between masculinity and violence. We know that men are more likely to commit homicides and more likely to commit crime in general. And this fact has really just been taken for granted and rarely studied. So in 2000, Brookman interviewed 20 men who had killed or violently assaulted other men and found that they were basically using violence to control others and to boost their masculine identity. It was important for these men to have others perceive them as being tough because to be a man is to be tough. And so he argued that men's use of violence is probably related to the positions they hold in society. So if men have another way of gaining status or masculine identity, they won't resort to violence, but if they don't, they will. We've also looked at social stratification in homicide. So a lot of research shows a link between crime and economic conditions. Poor people are more likely to be offenders and victims, and violent crime rates tend to be higher in poorer communities. So basically, poverty is believed to be very stressful, and this stress may then result in violence. So if you grow up in an area where violence is common and where negative role models overshadow positive ones, this may foster criminal behavior. In 1987, Wilson wrote The Truly Disadvantaged, in which he argued that high levels of concentrated disadvantage and poverty generate high levels of crime. It's not simply a one-to-one relationship, but these communities actually have exponentially greater rates of homicide. And this is a pattern that holds true for both black and white communities. So what is it about the U.S.? How come we have such a high rate of homicide compared to other countries? Well, economic stratification. Studies tell us that countries with high income inequality have higher rates of homicide. Gun ownership is pretty common here. Assaults with guns are more likely to end in death. And there's subcultural arguments that relate to the history and culture of violence in the United States. We also want to look at the role of alcohol in drug use. This hasn't been widely studied, but there does appear to be a strong relationship. Over half of homicides involved victims or offenders who were under the influence at the time of the homicide, with alcohol being used more frequently than drugs. Alcohol appears to be a causal agent, while the relationship between drugs and homicide is unclear. So the drugs and homicide and the alcohol could both be lifestyle and routine activities factors, or it could be some combination of biological and environmental factors that, when brought together in the presence of alcohol and drugs, increases the likelihood of homicide. And that's the end of chapter 6.